All right, so part 3 of our evolution notes is the history of evolution. So we'll talk about a lot of the scientists' names. You'll notice that these are part of the objectives for today's lesson. So you want to make sure that you keep them separate. You know who did what. I would maybe recommend making Quizlets of them so that you know. All right, so earliest contributors. Comte de Buffon, 1707 to 1788. He wrote 36 volumes on the natural world, and he had planned to write 50. So he died before he got the total. He was going to write 50. But the key here is not that he wrote all these books and that he, did all of this encyclopedic research on different organisms. It's that he thought about Earth and life in new ways. This is one of the first times where someone really thought about how Earth had a history and had changed over time. Prior to that, people, thought about Earth as having had some sort of history. It was there before they were born and it would be there after they died. But they didn't necessarily think about how Earth had changed in that time and how maybe the plants and animals had changed over that time. Next is Erasmus Darwin. He was born in 1731, died in 1802. He was a natural philosopher, physiologist, inventor, and poet. And many of these things were important. Natural philosopher, that means he was interested in the natural world. Physiologist, he kind of was that era's definition almost of a doctor. So he could, do some things and understood some things about the human body. But what I really want to talk about is the fact that he was a poet, and not a sentence I often say in science, but for today we do. And that's because his poems included the natural history. So he really thought a lot about that natural history, but also they discussed the relatedness of all forms of life. So they kind of planted this idea in the head of his grandson, Charles Darwin. And we'll learn more about him later, so don't you worry, because he's the big name here. Next, I want to talk about the geologists who contributed. I talked a lot about how those layers of rock are important in understanding what was older and what was younger. Charles Lyell, 1797 to 1875, he actually studied the Temple of Scrapus. And so you might not think that that would count as a geologist, but I'm going to lump it into the same category because it's looking at like the order of these layers. So he's studying this temple. It was built on land, and there's records of it being used until 200 AD. In the 1800s, the temple floor was below the high tide mark. So the high tide mark in the 1800s, when Charles Lyell was studying it, would have been below water. So your high tide mark might be here. But there was erosion in the columns above that mark. So there was erosion at other places in the columns. And that erosion looks like it had been caused specifically by wave action, by that water coming in and out. If it would have been wind erosion, we would have expected the wind hits the whole column at once. But if you have a water level, for example, that goes to here and then it goes up here, you would expect this part to get more erosion because it's getting the waves hitting it as the tide goes in and then goes out, whereas the part below that might not get as much erosion. His result was that in less than 2,000 years, he said that the temple had sunk below sea level and was raised up again. So the key here is that the natural processes and time could produce changes. So not just the natural processes of that wave action causing erosion, but also that time could change things, and that somehow the water level had risen above this temple and then receded again. And then we have to talk about Lamarck. Lamarck is one of the best examples of science setting things right, I guess you might say. So Lamarck had a theory. His theory was called use and disuse. And his theory was that organisms could change size or shape of the organs by either using them or not using them. And part of his evidence was, blacksmiths and their sons have strong arms, so the blacksmith must be able to pass those strong arms on to his son. and that the blacksmith's arms would get stronger over time. And we know that to be true. If you go work out, you're going to get stronger over time, right? However, you building up a bunch of muscle is not going to mean that you're going to have a super muscly baby. So that is the part where that kind of theory doesn't work. This use and disuse can't really be passed on. He also, another example he used was giraffes' necks would get longer as they stretched. So the baby giraffes would have not as long of a neck. And then as they stretched to get food, they would get longer necks. Now, his mistakes. He did not know how the traits were inherited. So because he didn't understand genetics and how like the father might pass the trait on to the son, because he didn't have that key part, because he wasn't thinking about that inheritance, he was only thinking about these changes happening over the course of time in one individual. And that can only explain small changes. It can't explain big overarching changes in an organism over like long periods of time. So for example, you might be able to use this to explain like the blacksmith getting stronger over the course of his life, but you can't use it to explain something like a fish suddenly having stripes and the striped fish becoming more and more common. Also, we know now genes are not changed by activities in life, or at least not most of them. There are some exceptions there, because I know we talked about, mutations can happen and that can cause cancer. So, but in general, we're not going to have genes changed for like hair color by activities in life. So you're not going to suddenly go from brown to blonde, for example. Change through mutation occurs before an organism is born that can give rise to those different phenotypes. So if you were going to have like a hair color change from brown to blonde, you would see that kind of mutation happen before the organism is born. And that brings us to Charles Darwin. From 1809 to 1882, he was a British naturalist, and he proposed the idea of evolution by natural selection. He collected clear evidence to support his ideas, and we're going to talk about some of that evidence as we go through. So here we have his finches. We'll talk about the evidence he collected from the birds and see how that impacted his theory. So first, he went on a voyage of the HMS Beagle. So this was a ship, sailed around the world. You'll notice it goes around South America. Its goal was actually mapping the coastline of South America, so that was its main goal. But the place where Darwin got a lot of his information was actually the Galapagos Islands, so these islands here. And the reason for that is that islands have small area and animals are kind of trapped on them for the most part. So animals don't tend to move from island to island very commonly. And so what happens is if you have environmental changes, say you have environmental changes on this island, the animals will have to either adapt or die off. And so we tend to see these environmental changes happening and adaptations occurring because the animals can't just move away. If this happens like, here where we are, and there's some environmental condition, animals can either move north or move south or east or west. They can move in order to get to better conditions. So because of that, we don't see these pressures on selection that we see in other places. And I want to emphasize that it's the pressures on selection. The animals are not choosing to adapt. So this is something we're going to talk about when we get into natural selection. But the animals don't choose to adapt. They are just kind of forced to adapt by those environmental conditions and by the selection pressure on those conditions and on the animals struggling to survive in them. So the Beagle travels around the world from 1831 to 1836. It makes many observations of the natural world. The main objective was to chart the South American coastline. So like I said, the main objective was South America. Now, one of the things he studied when he got to the Galapagos was the finches. And what he saw was that there was a correlation of species of finch to food source. So the different species of finch tended to attract and be attracted towards one food source. That's all they would eat. So here's our common ancestor from the South American mainland. We have three main categories: ground finches, tree finches, and warbler finches. The green warbler finch and the gray warbler finch here have these kind of pointier beaks. But what I want you to focus on is going to be more of these other categories. So what he found was, of the ground finches, they would eat either seeds or cactus flowers because that was what was available at the ground. The tree finches would eat either buds in the tree or insects because that's what they could get in the tree. Then he looked and he saw that these ones that eat seeds tended to have more sturdy beaks. The ones that eat flowers, so even though these ones are pretty related because they're all found on the ground and they're very related in other ways, they tended to have more pointy beaks for getting those cactus flowers without getting like cactus spines in their face. The ones who could get the cactus flower without getting, stabbed would be better able to reproduce and have more babies than ones who got, injured. The bud eater here has kind of an intermediate beak. And then the insect eaters, they may vary based on like which insect as well. So we have lots of insect eaters, but you can see that comparing the insect eaters' mouths to those cactus flower, their beaks, they tend to be a little bit sturdier, but not quite as sturdy as these larger seed eaters, because the seed eaters have to like break apart the seed. So here are our insect eaters, our flower eaters, and then our seed eaters. And he saw that there was this similarity in that beak shape based on what they ate. And this is where we see rapid speciation. New species filled new niches. They inherited successful adaptations, and this is what we call adaptive radiation. So as time went on, and as this common ancestor went into many new island habitats, the new species, the new introduced finch, had to fill a new niche because there may not have been opportunities in the old niche. So say, this common ancestor goes to an island and there aren't any trees. So in order for it to live, it lives on the ground. And it might not be the best at that, but over time, it becomes better adapted because the individuals that are more adapted at life on the ground and eating seeds are the ones that get enough food and have more babies. And if this happens in enough new niches, so in enough new areas or enough new types of like modes of life, we get this adaptive radiation. So Darwin's finches, different beaks equal different food. There's different food found on different islands. We tended to see different birds on different islands. So you have those beak shapes correlating to food type. We see this with other animals too. If you go to Fernbank, the two big dinosaur fossils in the center atrium at the Fernbank Natural History Museum, you have the Argentinosaurus, and I think it might be an Albertosaurus, but the Argentinosaurus is a long-necked plant eater, and its teeth look like this, very flat. The teeth of the other dinosaur, the meat eater, are very pointy because the meat eater is going to be tearing apart that plant eater. The plant eater needs these flat teeth because it's basically got, its upper teeth and its lower teeth, and they're just going to grind to break up the leafy matter in order to eat it. He also looked at turtles. So Darwin observed that characteristics of many different plants and animals varied. So he looked at tortoises. The shape of this shell would correspond to different habitats. So here we have our Hood Island tortoise. It has the curved shell, and the shell is open around the neck and legs. This allows the tortoise to actually reach vegetation. So it can use its long neck. It can use this opening in the shell to actually maneuver a little bit better in order to get the sparse vegetation, because Hood Island doesn't have a lot of food for tortoises. The tortoise from Isabella Island has more of a dome-shaped shell, and it has a much, much shorter neck. Like this neck is like nothing compared to that Hood Island tortoise neck. Vegetation on that island is very abundant. It's much closer to the ground. And so it can afford to have this more dome-shaped shell in order to provide it protection from other organisms. The tortoise from Pinta Island is kind of intermediate. And that's because it has, an intermediate level of food availability. And again, these would be adaptations. So the first tortoises on Hood Island may have looked more similar to this tortoise or this tortoise. But over time, the ones that had the longer necks were the ones that could get more food. So they lived long enough to have babies. Many islands also showed distinct local variations in tortoise morphology. So you might see like very local variation on one island. So Darwin was thinking perhaps these are the first steps in splitting into like one species into many species. He noticed that there were these variations. Maybe this is what happens first, and then eventually you get many new species. Now, like I said, that voyage was to 1836. Darwin returned to England in 1836, and he wrote papers describing his collections and observations. He wrote a long, long treatise on barnacles, so a book basically on barnacles. And he drafted the theory of species formation in 1844. So 8 years after he finished the voyage and had, spent that time going through his notebooks and looking at his sketches and things. However, he told his wife to publish it posthumously. So he wanted his wife to publish it after he died. He was reluctant to publish, but he didn't want the idea to die with him. So this is important. At the time, he had some concerns about publishing, because he had concerns that this work would be taken as like heresy or something, like he would be a heretic, that's the pronunciation, in the church if he published this work. So how did it get published? If he asked his wife to publish it, is that what happened? Well, no. In 1858, Darwin received a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace had written a short paper with a new theory based on his work in the East Indies, a different set of islands, and he asked Darwin to evaluate that theory and then to pass it along for publication. So two scientists kind of collaborating a little bit, going back and forth, and Wallace asked him, hey, look at this theory that I have based on what I've seen in the East Indies. And Darwin looked at it. And the time was ripe for the idea. Darwin told him he should publish, basically. And he published, you'll notice this was February of 1858. He published on the tendency of varieties to depart indefinitely from the original type. So Alfred Russel Wallace is talking about starting with one species and varieties to depart from that original kind of species into many, many different variations. Now, many of you have probably heard of Darwin's name before now, but not too many know of Alfred Russel Wallace. So why might that be? Darwin actually published after. He published in 1859. The reason for that is probably multi-parts, but one of them is that Darwin wrote in a much more accessible way than Wallace. So his was on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. So he didn't focus so much on just one species, even though like Wallace, like he did focus on one species in many of the chapters, but his writing was just a little bit more accessible, a little bit more flowery and readable by people in the era. And maybe that is because his, grandfather was a poet. Who knows? He wrote to Lyell, "Your words have come true with a vengeance. I never saw a more striking coincidence, so all my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed." So he wrote back to a geologist, to Lyell, who they were talking about all of this, saying that, we're all having this idea all at the same time. So Alfred Russel Wallace was having it, Darwin was having it, Lyell had part of that piece too. Remember, he was the one with the temple. So the time was definitely ripe for this idea. If Darwin hadn't been the one to publish, it would have come out through the work by like Wallace and others. So here is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And I will, if I can find my copy, I'll bring it to class so you can see how thick it is. Maybe I'll take a picture for those of you that aren't in class. All right, so what were Darwin's ideas? And there were lots and lots of ideas in there. There are some ideas in Origin of Species that have been not supported by evidence. Remember, we don't say proved, not supported by the evidence, but many that have been supported by further research. So first, he said variation exists in natural populations. You guys know this. You know, you look at different kinds of dogs and they're all different. Even if you're looking at animals that aren't as dissimilar as dogs, if you're looking at like a whole bunch of flamingos at Zoo Atlanta when you first walk in, they look different. Some of them have more dark feathers, some of them have more bright feathers, some are taller, some are shorter. There's variation. He also noticed that in the wild, animals had many more offspring each season than could possibly survive to maturity. So they had lots more babies than could live. As a result, there was a struggle for existence or competition. So because there are more babies than there are resources for, so there's not enough food or space or water for all of the babies have to compete. Characteristics that are beneficial in that competition, so in the struggle for existence, will tend to become more common as those individuals have their own children, puppies, whatever. So changing the average characteristics of the population. So this is where we get the adaptation in the population and becoming more common. So for example, we might have lots of green fish because they blend in. But then suddenly there's not as much algae because the pond gets clean, and so now the silverfish blend in a little bit more and they don't get eaten. So over time, you may see that a population that had many, many green fish and only a couple silverfish will have more and more silverfish as the silverfish are able to reproduce more and have more little fish babies. And over long periods of time, giving a steady input of new variation in a population, and that new variation can come from mutation. The processes would lead to the emergence of new species. So these are Darwin's ideas. So at the end of this section, you should practice. So just make sure you remember a couple of the facts that we have gone over in this section. What was the name of the ship? Describe one of the examples of speciation that Darwin saw. So that's where he saw differences in an animal. And then why did he publish when he did? So if you're doing this virtual, go ahead and turn those in on PowerSchool so that I can grade those. And if you're in class, we will just take a break and make sure you guys are talking about this, and we'll check everybody in class. All right.